A racist officer beats a black disabled boy with a baton, unaware that the boy's father is a high-ranking Army general. What happens next will leave you speechless. The streets were quiet that evening, the amber glow of the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows against the cracked pavement. The faint hum of distant traffic provided a dull backdrop, interrupted only by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the rustling of wind against loose trash. 16-year-old Malik Hayes was used to moving carefully through his neighborhood, his steps measured, deliberate. He had learned over the years to keep his head down, to avoid unnecessary attention, to blend into the night like a whisper. But his limp made that difficult. Every step came with a subtle hesitation, his left leg dragging slightly behind due to the childhood accident that had left him with permanent nerve damage. It was an old wound, one he had learned to live with, but never one that let him forget. Every time he moved, he felt it, like a silent reminder of his vulnerability. But it didn't make him weak. If anything, it had made him stronger, more aware, more resilient. That night, he had only one goal: to get home. He had been out longer than expected, the quick trip to the corner store stretching into a drawn-out errand after running into an older neighbor who had asked him to help carry a bag of groceries. His father, General Richard Hayes, would expect him back soon. The man was strict, precise, decades of military discipline instilled in his every move. But beneath the hardened exterior was a father who cared deeply. Malik had grown up between two worlds, caught in the ever-present tension between the rigid expectations of his father's rank and the harsh realities of his neighborhood. He understood structure, respect, and discipline, but he also understood survival, the unspoken rules of the streets, the invisible lines that dictated who was safe and who wasn't. He had learned early on that even when you followed the rules, even when you did everything right, sometimes that wasn't enough. His fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack as he walked, the weight of his notebooks pressing against his back, the rustle of plastic barely audible inside. He had picked up a few snacks, something to hold him over before bed. The store clerk had barely acknowledged him, giving only the slightest nod as Malik handed over his money. He was used to that, too. The silent transactions, the wary glances, the way people measured him the moment he walked in. It was the same look he had seen his father receive on more than one occasion when they were out together. The flicker of uncertainty in strangers' eyes before they realized who he was, before they understood that the man in uniform commanded more power than they ever would. But Malik didn't have that kind of presence. To the world, he was just another black boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't see the patrol car at first, didn't hear the low, predatory hum of the engine idling in the distance. But then, just as he neared the street corner, the sharp flash of red and blue lights cut through the night, staining the pavement with eerie, pulsing colors. His stomach tightened. The air around him felt heavier, charged with an unspoken warning. A voice, gruff and authoritative, filled with something Malik couldn't quite name, pierced the quiet. The officer called out to him, his tone not one of simple inquiry but of command, the kind that expected instant obedience. He told him to stop, his voice carrying across the empty street like a crack of thunder. Malik knew better than to ignore it. He knew better than to run, even if his leg had allowed him to. Running was never an option, not for him, not for anyone who looked like him. He turned slowly, making sure his movements were measured, controlled. He had been taught how to handle situations like this. His father had drilled it into him time and time again. The do's and don'ts, the careful balance between compliance and self-preservation. His hands lifted slightly, fingers spread just enough to show he had nothing to hide. He kept his expression neutral, his breath even. His father always told him to remain calm, to speak clearly, to never give them a reason to escalate. But Malik knew that sometimes they didn't need a reason. Sometimes it was already decided before the first word was spoken. Officer Daniel Grayson stepped out of the squad car, his heavy boots striking the pavement with purpose. He was tall, broad, his uniform stretched tightly over his frame. There was something in the way he carried himself, in the way he moved, that spoke of unchecked authority, the kind that had long since settled into entitlement. His badge gleamed under the streetlights, the radio on his shoulder crackling softly with static. He had the posture of a man who believed he was untouchable, that his word was law, that his presence alone demanded submission. His eyes swept over Malik, pausing at the slight hunch of his shoulder, the uneven stance of his leg. Malik recognized that look immediately, the brief flicker of assessment, the way Grayson's lip curled slightly, as if already deciding something before a single word was exchanged. Grayson asked for ID, his tone sharp, clipped. There was no pretense of courtesy, no real reason for the request other than the need to assert control. Malik swallowed, his throat dry but nodded. He told the officer he had it in his pocket, his voice steady but careful. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible as he reached for it. But Grayson wasn't looking for cooperation. He wasn't looking for compliance. He was looking for something else, something more. There was a shift in his stance, a barely perceptible tension in his shoulders as he barked at Malik to move faster. There was something in his voice that made Malik's stomach knot, a sharpness, an edge of something cruel. The words weren't just instructions. They were laced with something more. Disdain, amusement. The moment stretched too long, the air between them thick with unspoken expectation. Malik hesitated for just half a second, just the briefest pause, but it was enough. Grayson took the pause as defiance. In a blink, the officer closed the distance between them, his hand snapping out with a force that sent a jolt of pain through Malik's wrist. His grip was unforgiving, fingers digging into the soft flesh, pressing against bone with enough pressure to bruise. The sudden movement sent a spike of adrenaline through Malik's veins, his heart slamming against his ribs. His backpack slipped from his shoulder, hitting the pavement with a soft, muted thud. And then came the first strike. The baton cracked against Malik's ribs, the impact sending a searing bolt of pain through his torso. His breath caught in his throat, his body instinctively recoiling from the blow. But Grayson didn't stop. The baton came down again, harder this time, the force driving Malik to his knees. His left leg buckled instantly, unable to support him against the assault. His hands scrambled for balance, fingers grazing rough pavement. But there was no escape. A third blow struck his side, sending him sprawling onto the ground. His vision blurred for a moment, stars dancing across his sight as the pain settled deep into his bones. The cold concrete bit into his cheek, the taste of copper blooming on his tongue. He could hear the faint rustling of his backpack a few feet away, the quiet mockery of scattered papers against the pavement. Grayson's breath was heavy above him, his presence looming, suffocating. Malik forced himself to stay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed the rules. And yet, here he was, lying on the ground beneath the weight of a man who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. And he knew. This was far from over. The baton came down hard against Malik's ribs, the solid steel core striking his body with a sickening force. The impact sent a violent shockwave of pain through his torso, white-hot agony erupting beneath his skin as though his bones themselves had cracked under the weight of the blow. His breath caught in his throat, stolen in an instant, and for a brief, terrifying moment he couldn't inhale. His chest spasmed in search of air, but the pain was too great, the searing ache spreading from his ribs to his spine in an unforgiving wave. His knee buckled almost instantly, his damaged leg unable to bear his weight. It gave out beneath him, the old injury flaring up with a cruel intensity as he crumpled toward the pavement. The rough asphalt scraped against his palms as he instinctively tried to brace himself. But there was no time. No space between the first strike and what came next. Grayson didn't stop. Before Malik could even register the first blow, the second came down with even greater force. The baton cracked against his back, sending another explosion of agony ripping through his body. His spine arched instinctively, his muscles seizing up in an effort to shield him from the assault, but it was useless. Another strike landed against his side, the impact forcing a sharp, broken gasp from his lips. His body convulsed involuntarily, his limbs jerking as he curled inward, trying to protect himself. But there was nowhere to go. The pavement was unyielding beneath him, and the hands that should have protected him were too busy holding him down. His arm was yanked away before he could use it to shield his face. The force of it sent him off balance, his cheek smacking hard against the concrete. His vision blurred, a dizzying swirl of colors and shapes, but he could still make out the shadow looming over him, the dark silhouette of Grayson standing tall, his breath heavy with exertion and something far more sinister. The night air felt thick, suffocating, pressing against Malik's skin like a second layer of weight added to the officer's grip. The baton struck again. The pain this time was different, sharper, deeper, something that burrowed into his body and refused to leave. A sound escaped him, something between a gasp and a whimper, but it was swallowed by the quiet hum of the street. His ribs screamed in protest, the pulsing agony growing unbearable, but he knew that showing pain would only make it worse. The moment he broke, the moment he gave in, it would feed whatever hunger lived in Grayson's chest. Grayson was speaking, his voice thick with something beyond anger. It wasn't just rage, it was something worse. It was satisfaction. It was hunger. It was the unchecked thirst for dominance, the kind of twisted pleasure that came from knowing he could do whatever he wanted, knowing no one would question him. His breath was uneven, his words laced with the bitter edge of control. Malik's head spun, the words blurring together, the world narrowing into nothing but the feeling of each blow as it landed. Malik coughed, his breath rattling in his chest, but he forced himself to speak. His voice was weak, broken by the pain, but he pushed the words out anyway. He said he didn't do anything. He tried to explain, to reason, even though he knew it wouldn't matter. He barely recognized the sound of his own voice, thin, hoarse, and barely audible over the pounding in his skull. That only made it worse. Grayson's knee slammed into Malik's back, the sudden weight crushing against his spine with such force that his breath was forced from his lungs in a sharp, painful wheeze. The officer shifted his weight, pressing down harder, and Malik felt his ribs scream in protest beneath the unbearable pressure. His body twisted instinctively, struggling against the force, but it was no use. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain searing through his muscles. His fingers twitched against the pavement, grasping at nothing, as if he could somehow ground himself against the agony. Then, another strike, this time against his already injured leg. A strangled sound tore from Malik's throat, raw and guttural, before he could stop it. His body convulsed, the pain flaring so intensely that his vision went white for a split second. His legs seized up, muscles locking in a spasm so violent that he could feel them twisting beneath his skin. The pain was unbearable, a molten hot agony that burned through his nerves like fire. His body twitched, his limbs jerking in protest, but it wasn't voluntary. The shock was setting in, numbing his fingers, making his head feel distant, disconnected from the rest of him. The night swallowed his pain. The sound of Malik's body hitting the pavement was softer than it should have been, muffled by the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. The world around him had dimmed into a hazy, disjointed blur. Sirens in the distance, voices crackling through radios, the clicking of handcuffs that he barely registered. He could feel his own heartbeat pounding against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed out of sync with the rest of his body. His lips parted, tasting blood, the metallic tang pooling on his tongue. His body refused to move. Every inch of him felt heavy, as if the pain had seeped into his very bones and made them immovable. He tried to lift his arm, to shift even slightly, but the moment he did, a fresh wave of agony lashed through his ribs. A deep ache settled into his chest, an unbearable tightness that made every breath a battle. His mind screamed at him to stay still, to not provoke anything further, to let the weight of injustice crush him quietly. And then, footsteps. Not the slow, predatory steps of Grayson, not the indifferent shuffling of his silent partner. These steps were different, fast, purposeful, deliberate. There was something wrong about them, something that sent a different kind of chill down Malik's spine. He barely had the strength to lift his head, but he didn't need to. The air itself changed, thickening with something unspoken, something even Grayson must have felt. A new voice sliced through the night. It was cold, colder than the night air, colder than the pavement beneath Malik's body, colder than the weight of the baton that had left him broken. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, something sharper. A voice that carried with it the kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. A voice that carried weight. The voice told Grayson to get off his son. And just like that, the entire world shifted. General Richard Hayes had spent most of his life in war zones, his boots pressed into foreign soil. His commands followed without question. He had seen men break under pressure, had witnessed death in its rawest, most unfiltered form, had stood among chaos and kept his composure. He had held dying soldiers in his arms, had given orders that sent men into battles they wouldn't return from, had watched destruction unfold before his very eyes. But nothing had ever ignited the kind of rage that consumed him when he saw his son lying broken on the ground. The sight of Malik's battered body twisted something deep inside of him, something primal and unforgiving. His presence alone was overwhelming, a force that could silence an entire room without a single word. His posture was ramrod straight, the disciplined rigidity of a soldier ingrained into his very being, but beneath that carefully controlled exterior was a fury so intense it could have melted steel. His broad chest rose and fell with measured, controlled breaths, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the veins along his forearms pulsing with restrained aggression. His entire body screamed power, the kind of power that men like Grayson couldn't ignore, the kind that didn't need to be stated to be understood. Grayson froze, his baton still gripped tightly in his hand. The officer had been mid-motion, preparing for another strike, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Something had changed. The air itself felt charged, thick with a tension so suffocating that even the night seemed to hold its breath. For the first time that evening, hesitation flickered in Grayson's eyes. The confidence that had been so solid, so unwavering, faltered, just for a second. His partner, who had up until now remained indifferent, shifted uncomfortably beside the squad car. There was something unspoken between the two officers, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had taken an unexpected turn. Grayson opened his mouth, his voice gruff, defensive. He attempted to regain control of the moment, to reclaim the dominance he had wielded so effortlessly just seconds ago. He referred to Malik as a suspect, the word rolling off his tongue with the same casual authority he had used countless times before. But he never got the chance to finish. The general cut him off with a stare so sharp it could slice through bone. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bore into Grayson with a force that sent an involuntary shiver down the officer's spine. His voice was controlled, steady, but laced with a quiet venom that made the words even more dangerous. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stated the truth, a truth so undeniable that it crushed whatever illusion of power Grayson still clung to. That boy on the ground, the one Grayson had beaten so mercilessly, was his son. Silence. The weight of those words settled heavily over the street, suffocating in its finality. Even the wind seemed to have died, as if the world itself was holding still, waiting for what would come next. The implications of the general's words began to sink in, their gravity pressing down on Grayson's chest like an immovable weight. The partner shifted again, his discomfort growing more evident by the second. He scrambled for an explanation, his words tumbling out hurriedly. He insisted that Malik had resisted, that force had been necessary, but the words felt hollow, weak, completely ineffective in the face of the man standing before them. Hayes ignored him. His focus remained solely on his son, his trained hands moving with precise efficiency as he knelt beside Malik. Years of battlefield experience guided him as he assessed the damage. His fingers brushed lightly over Malik's ribs, tracing the deep bruises that were already beginning to form. His touch was careful, but his mind was calculating, taking note of every injury, every swollen joint, every drop of blood. His fingers trembled slightly, a rare and almost imperceptible sign of emotion that only someone who knew him well would have recognized. But his voice, when he spoke again, was nothing short of lethal. He didn't waste words. He didn't demand explanations or offer threats. He simply issued a single unwavering command, one that left no room for argument. He ordered them to call their superior, immediately. Grayson hesitated. For the first time since the night had begun, doubt crept into his features. It was subtle at first, a flicker in his expression, a brief tightening of his jaw. He had been so certain of himself, so confident in his authority. But now there was something else, something unfamiliar. The arrogance that had fueled him all night flickered. Just a flicker, before something darker took its place. Rage, resentment, the slow, simmering realization that he had made a mistake. And worse than that, the kind of mistake that mattered. The general's posture didn't change. He didn't move an inch, but his presence grew heavier, his silence louder than any shouted command. And then, without breaking eye contact, without raising his voice, he delivered the final blow. His voice dropped to a whisper, low and venomous, each word coated in an unshakable certainty. He promised Grayson that he would personally make sure he lost everything. The words sank in deep. Grayson's face paled slightly, his jaw clenched, his grip on the baton tightening before loosening just as quickly. His body tensed, rigid with the kind of fear he had never experienced before. He had beaten plenty of black boys before, had wielded his badge like a weapon against countless faces that the world wouldn't bother to remember. But none of them had fathers who commanded entire battalions. None of them had the weight of military power standing behind them, ready to crush anything in its path. For the first time that night, Grayson felt powerless. The partner glanced at Grayson, his nervousness growing by the second. His fingers hovered near his radio, his body shifting between uncertainty and panic. He was watching a dynamic unfold that he had never seen before, one where the man they had brutalized wasn't the one trembling in fear. The general didn't move. He didn't have to. The weight of his name alone had already done what no amount of pleading, no amount of justification, ever could. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Grayson understood what it felt like to be on the other end of unchecked power. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Calls were made before the night was even over, words exchanged in cold, clipped tones between men who carried weight in their voices, men who understood that certain lines were never meant to be crossed. Before the first light of dawn, the chain of command had already been set in motion. The gears of consequence turned faster than Grayson could have anticipated, faster than he could react to, faster than any excuse he could formulate. By morning, he was placed on administrative leave. The official statement was filled with the usual vague language, an ongoing investigation, an internal review, but the meaning beneath it was clear. He was being pushed out. Within weeks, the termination was finalized. The department distanced itself from him with mechanical efficiency, severing ties as though he had never existed among their ranks. The thin blue line that had protected him, shielded him, allowed him to move without consequence, now fractured beneath the weight of the wrong name, the wrong enemy. But that wasn't enough for Hayes. The general did not believe in half measures. Retaliation was not simply about punishment, it was about eradication. He understood that men like Grayson were never truly gone unless they were erased, unless their power was stripped so thoroughly that they became untouchable, not in the way that shields them, but in the way that leaves them abandoned, exiled from the very institutions that once protected them. He ensured that every connection he had in the military, in law enforcement, in government, knew the name of the officer who had brutalized his son. He did not have to make threats. He did not have to yell. A quiet conversation in the right ear, a carefully placed word at the right time, was enough. Grayson's name was no longer one that opened doors. It was one that closed them. No department would take him. No station would hire him. His reputation dissolved like smoke, his existence reduced to nothing more than a whispered cautionary tale among the ranks. His name became a warning to others who thought they could wield their badge like a weapon unchecked, a silent lesson etched into the fabric of every precinct that had once looked the other way. He was not just unemployed, he was unredeemable, but it didn't undo the damage. Malik's ribs took months to heal. The deep bruising along his side faded in slow, uneven patches, dark splotches turning yellow, then green, then vanishing into his skin as though they had never been there. But he could still feel them. Every breath, every shift in movement, sent a dull ache through his bones, a constant reminder of how easily his body had been broken. The doctors assured him that his body would recover, that with time the pain would lessen, that the fractures would mend. But no one spoke about the wounds that did not show. The nightmares lasted longer. He would wake in the middle of the night, his breath caught in his throat, his body drenched in sweat. The weight of Grayson's knee pressed into his back even in sleep, the phantom blows of the baton striking against his ribs, his legs, his skull. The pavement was beneath him again, cold and unyielding, the red and blue lights flashing against the inside of his eyelids. He tried to force them away, tried to remind himself that he was safe, But the fear did not listen to reason. It coiled inside him, whispering of things he could not forget, things that waited in the corners of his mind, ready to resurface at the slightest provocation. He flinched at sirens. The sound, once just another piece of background noise, now sent his pulse into a frantic staccato, his muscles locking up before his brain could even register the reaction. He tensed when officers walked by, his body instinctively shrinking inward, as though preparing itself for another blow, another night where the rules did not matter. He hated it. Hated that his body betrayed him, that no matter how much time passed, the scars beneath his skin refused to let go. His father, once a symbol of strength, now hovered like a guardian afraid to blink. Hayes had always been a man of discipline, of controlled authority, a man who commanded respect without the need for force. But something in him had changed. The rigid certainty that had always defined him now carried a trace of something else, something softer, something more fragile. He watched Malik more closely, noted the way his son's shoulders tensed when passing police cars, the way his fingers curled into his palms when conversations veered too close to that night. Hayes had always taught his son to stand tall, to never let fear dictate his movements. But now, he worried. There were moments when he caught himself standing outside Malik's room at night, listening for the steady rhythm of his breathing, ensuring that he was still there. He had fought wars, had seen death in its most violent forms, but nothing had ever made him feel powerless the way watching his son suffer did. He had won the battle, had ensured that the man responsible was stripped of everything, but it did not feel like victory. Justice had been served, but the cost had already been paid. And somewhere, in a quiet room far removed from the world that had once granted him power, Grayson sat alone. His hands, the same hands that had once clenched around a baton with the certainty of untouchability, now gripped nothing but regret. The silence around him was suffocating, pressing in from all sides like an unseen force, like the slow decay of everything he had built. His badge, his authority, his security, gone. The men he had once called brothers no longer answered his calls. The department he had served, the system he had upheld, had discarded him without hesitation. He had told himself once that what he had done was justified, that it had been necessary. That force was a tool, that control was an expectation. But now, stripped of everything, he was left with nothing but the echoes of his own actions. Power had always been a constant in his life. It had been his weapon, his armor, the thing that made the world bend to his will. But now, as he sat in the dim quiet of his isolation, staring at the empty space where his future used to be, he understood the truth. Power was only power until it met something greater.